Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We are delighted to be joined this evening by Quinty Outman of the University of Leeds, who will be delivering a talk entitled "'Tis But a Flesh Wound, Exploring the Appearance and Function of the Wound Man in Late Medieval Medicine." Quinty is a PhD student at Leeds University and president of the Leeds Medieval Society, as well as co-initiator of the university's Digital Humanities Research Group. They researched the representation of the male body in late medieval diagrams, focusing on the impaired, wounded, and sick body, and discussing the relationship between medieval medicine, art, and masculinities. They completed their master's degree in medieval studies, also at the University of Leeds, where they wrote their dissertation on the importance of trust in the late medieval patient-medieval practitioner relationship. They also hold a BA in history from Leiden University, where they discovered their interest in medieval medicine and where they researched the influence of medical theory on the responses made by London's and Florence's local authorities to 14th-century plague outbreaks. They published an article on this subject in 2020 in the History Student Times, along with a piece in 2021 on women's looks and character in Boccaccio's 14th-century novel, The Decameron. They worked from 2021 as a contributor to the International Medieval Bibliography, and from 2022 to 2023 was an intern at the IMS Special Collections and York Archaeological and Historical Society, where they were also a part of the Digital Explorations Project, which aims to enhance future research culture of digital humanities through a study of manuscript fragments from the Ripon Cathedral Library. And from March to May 2023, they were the events assistant for the workshop related for this project, which aimed to educate those involved in different digitization techniques and encourage future research collaborations. In addition, they were on the project team for the Ripon Cathedral Fragments Day, an event hosted by university's social collections that brought together various people to uncover the hidden history of manuscript fragments in Ripon Cathedral's library books. Their research focuses on 14th and 15th century medicine, bodies, and masculinities, and they presented their first paper in 2024 at the International Medieval Congress, also on the subject of the different wound man diagrams. Quinty, it's great to have you with us today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Should I share my screen and get started?
Yeah, please do. Absolutely.
Yeah. Is that working?
Yep, that's all good.
Cool, perfect. So yes, as the title suggests, I will be talking about the wound man diagram today in the late Middle Ages, specifically in the 15th century. And I will be discussing 4 sources today that have each have either one wound man or multiple wound men depicted in them. I will get started by discussing a bit of the historiography around this particular diagram to establish, first of all, the historiography, but also my argument that I will be trying to convey with this paper today. And after I've established that, I will be talking about the 4 sources and their wound men in chronological order. So firstly, a bit of background about the wound man itself. Compared to other known medieval medical diagrams, such as the vein man or the zodiac man, the wound man appears rather late in the Middle Ages. The first known wound man appears at the end of the 14th century, and all of the other examples appear in the 15th century, but there are not a lot of examples. Whereas other diagrams, again, like the vein man, they appeared for centuries before that. Given their semi-short history within the Middle Ages and their few examples compared to other diagrams, it is rather difficult to determine what exactly this diagram was meant to represent and what it was used for. This does not mean that historians and other scholars have not tried to define the use of this diagram. Like, for example, Fritz Saxel in 1942 said that, quote, "This mnemonic figure represents in a kind of synopsis the various injuries to the human body," end quote. Saxel here defines the diagram as something that people could learn from and memorize the injuries to the human body to therefore recognize them and treat them accordingly. Another different definition was provided by Jack Hartnell in 2019, who says that, quote, the wound man effectively functions as a human table of contents for the surgeon, end quote. I must say that Hartnell here was discussing one particular wound man in particular, which is also a wound man that I'll be discussing in a little bit. But he does not say that this definition differs for different wound men found in other sources. So to him, the wound man is a referential diagram. Having studied several wound men from the 15th century, I found that it's not this easy to determine what a wound man was meant to represent or what it was used for. Sometimes it is mnemonic, sometimes it is referential, but this cannot be said for every single one of them, every single one of the wound men. Nor can we really establish an initial or an original function of the wound man, given that we have so few examples. And I think my argument is best described by Peter Murray Jones, who wrote this in 1998, who states that, quote, the wound man's purpose is difficult to fathom, but the wound man sometimes seems to carry a decorative or symbolic meaning rather than a surgical learning device. Very few direct clues are ever found which make clear the wound man's significance in a particular context, end quote. And this is what I will be talking about today, and also what I will be arguing for today is that it can't, like with a diagram such as the wound man, one singular use or function cannot be determined for this diagram, given that it appears in so many different contexts, not only in different contexts within their sources, but also the sources themselves were created in different contexts for different people, meaning that the function of the diagram changes depending on which manuscript or incunabulum you're looking at. To illustrate my point, I once again will be talking about 4 sources, starting with the Wellcome Apocalypse manuscript, also known as Wellcome MS-49. Now, as with many sources in the Middle Ages, there is a lot of uncertainty about this particular manuscript and its background, but the general consensus is that it was created around 1420 in a German-speaking area. The arguments given for this is that, firstly, the art style is recognizably, like, from the first quarter of the 15th century, or like historians have recognized it as that, and it is more of like a German speaking area art style, like an art style found in those areas. Another reason for the geographical area is that some texts within this manuscript are written in German, whereas the rest is written in Latin. What exact kind of German is, once again, uncertain. Historians argue differently. I personally don't know it yet, so I cannot say, but I will be looking at that to determine the geographical area a bit better. Alongside the year of its creation and the geographical location, who it was created by and who it was created for is also uncertain. But looking at the manuscript itself, it tells us that it was most likely created in and for a monastic community, whether this be a female or male monastic community, we don't know. The argument for it being created in a monastic community is just the manuscript itself and how like especially the illumination inside. There are hundreds of like diagrams and illustrations found within this manuscript. They are all colored, and sometimes they cover the full folio, which would have cost like a lot of time, but also a lot of ink and colors as well. And the argument is that because of this and the extensiveness of the manuscript, it could have only been created in a professional scriptorium found in a monastic community. The reason for it being used by a monastic community is because of the contents. Besides the surgical part of this manuscript, which is the third part of the manuscript, it has different texts on different topics, and it's thus a miscellany, but it's a purposeful miscellany. It was created to be one work. It just includes different texts and different topics. The manuscript starts with apocalyptic texts, mainly the Apocalypse of St. John, which is where this manuscript gets its title, The Welcome Apocalypse, from. It is then followed by Ars Moriendi texts and other related texts, and then followed by the surgical text, and then lastly, it includes texts on morals, theology, etc. And whilst the surgical part would have been of use to medical practitioners or anyone interested in surgery outside of monastic communities, the extent of the theological, moral, and apocalyptic text included in his manuscript would not have been of much use for anyone outside of monastic communities. And while monastic communities would have used this, and as well as the surgical parts, and therefore it's argued that it was used within a monastic community. Having given some background, let's move on to the diagram itself. So on folio 35R, which is one of the first folios of the surgical part of this manuscript, we find the wound man. That is, it appears as a 4-folio diagram as a human figure with supposedly not really a determined sex. Like if you look at the body, I'm happy to discuss afterwards how I came to that conclusion. But for now, it's obvious that it's wearing underwear and there are no visible genitalia. Other than that, it is being hit and penetrated by several different weapons. It has buboes, wounds, sores, and it has animals in, on, and around the body. Interestingly, this is the only known wound man that actually has animals included, which is not odd to include in a surgical text because surgeons or people practicing surgery did deal with animal wounds and bites and stuff like that. It is just rather interesting that all of the other wound men that we know about do not include animals. Also around the wound man are several words and phrases with a number next to them. And this helps to determine the function of this particular wound man. And especially if one looks at the text related to the wound man and the text surrounding it. On folios 34R and V, so the preceding folios to the diagram, there are texts relating to the diagram itself, to which the diagram refers to. And therefore, I say that the function of this wound man is, in Jack Hartnell's quotes, a human table of contents. It's referential. This is exemplified by the head wound. The diagram itself obviously has a head wound on its head, and right next to which is a German text that says, and excuse my German, eine fließende Wunde an dem Haupte, which means a flowing or streaming wound on the head, so a bleeding wound on the head with a number next to it. If one looks at the preceding folio, one finds again a similar phrase, which is then followed by a way to treat this wound and to heal the patient who might suffer this wound. Therefore, the person using this could have used the diagram to identify a wound on a patient, look at the text next to it, refer back to another, to a preceding folio, and see how best to treat this or what the advice was on how to treat it. The second manuscript discussed today is Welcome MS 290. Not a lot is known about this either, but we know that it was created in the mid-15th century in England, and it is written in Middle English. There are some Latin words and phrases, but it's mostly Middle English. And it is a copy of Pseudo-Galen's Anatomia, who we now know was Pseudo-Galen, but in the Middle Ages was believed to be actually Galen, so it was actually believed to be a text written by Galen. There is some debate on whether or not the diagrams included in this manuscript were created post the creation of the original manuscript, but that is uncertain and I don't know. So I will not be treating it as that today. The wound itself appears at the end of the manuscript. It is the last in a series of different diagrams, and it once again appears as a human body, this time with male genitalia, and it once again has weapons around the body and swords, buboes, etc. But it is, like I said, lacking animals. It once again has words and phrases written around the diagram that relate to the particular affliction on the body. However, different to the Welcome Apocalypse is that this manuscript does not include a text to which the wound man and its phrases refer to. There are the only text that this manuscript includes is the Anatomia by Pseudo-Galen that does not actually discuss wounds or refer to the wound man at all. So what is the function of the wound man here? I argue that it's symbolic or authoritative for the commissioner and owner of this manuscript. And there are two main reasons for this. Firstly, is that the manuscript is a copy, again, of of a text written to be believed by Galen in that period. And Galen, being a big medical authority in the Middle Ages, owning a text by him was something that you could show off. Whether you actually knew the contents very well, memorized them, or whether you just owned it, you could show off that you owned a copy of Galen. The second argument is that the wound man included in this manuscript is part of a larger series, like diagram series, which I call the 5-figure series. It is also known as the Ketum series, which I will get into why I don't use that word in a little bit. But the 5-figure series is a series of diagrams that includes the wound man, vein man, zodiac man, disease man, and disease woman. This series, whether complete or incomplete, had been around for ages, like for ages before the creation of this manuscript, and it had already gained some sort of authority to show the knowledge that medical practitioners had of the human body, of the systems of the human body. The same goes for the 9-picture series, which is also known as the Fünf-Bilder series or the 5-picture series, which is a term created by Karl Südhoff in the 20th century, but it's now known that it includes more than 5 diagrams. It's usually 9, and this series includes diagrams like the bones, muscles, arteries, veins, etc. Now, Welcome MS 290 does not include the complete series, neither the 9-picture series or the 5-figure series. The 9-picture series, there's only the bones and the muscles, and of the 5-figure series, there's only the disease woman and the wound man. But still, despite them being incomplete, having diagrams that already had a longer history and already had some sort of authority with conveying medical knowledge meant that the owner of this manuscript could not only show off that they had a copy of Galen, but also had copies of colored and full folio diagrams that came with their own knowledge. So once again, here the wound man is symbolic or authoritative for the owner to show off the knowledge that they have and their capacity of commissioning a manuscript such as this. The third example is not actually a manuscript, it's an incunabulum, which is an early printed book, and it is called the Fasciculus Medicinae. The incunabulum is based on a lost 14th century manuscript, supposedly written by Johannes de Kettem. I say supposedly because we don't actually know who Johannes de Kettem was. Some historians argued that he was a 14th century German surgeon who was associated with a German university, but there is no concrete evidence to say that it was the same person. Now, the reason Kettem is said to be the author of this text, of the original text, is because he is literally named the author in the different incunabula, either at the start or at the end of the incunabula. It states that the original text was written by him. And given that all of the fasciculars incunabula include the 5-picture series that I just mentioned, the reason, because it always includes all of the 5 diagrams, that's the main reason why people have referred to it as the Kettem series rather than the 5-picture series. Again, I don't use that phrase because the diagrams included in that series had already been around before Kettem supposedly wrote his work, minus the Woundmann, of course. And the particular incunabulum I'm looking at today was printed in 1491 in Venice, but there are other later editions in from the 1490s that were also published in Venice in the same at the same printers, and there are also 3 examples of incunabula being printed in 3 different Spanish cities as well. The Woundmann it appears on folio 9R. It is very similar to the previous Woundmann shown in that once again, it's a human body like MS 290 with male genitalia. It has weapons, swords, buboes, etc. And it also includes phrases and words around the body that relate to the particular afflictions shown on the Woundmann itself. The difference here is, compared to the other 2, is that it also has lines coming out of particular afflictions that lead to either text boxes that explain the affliction and how to treat it, or it leads to letters that one can find, again, like with the Welcome Apocalypse, on different folio, this time the following folio, where there's once again a paragraph that explains what the wound is and how to treat it. And therefore, I argue once again that this Woundmann is referential, like the Welcome Apocalypse. And this is illustrated by looking at the same wound we looked at for the Welcome Apocalypse, the head wound that on the first picture leads to the letter B. And if one goes to the next folio and goes to the paragraph headed by B, one will see contra fluxum fulneris in capite, which is once again against the flowing wound in the head. The last example is again an incunabulum, so an early printed book, this time published in Germany, in Strasbourg in 1497. And it was written by Hieronymus Brunswick, who was a German surgeon. He actually also commissioned a printed version of his work, and it is completely written in German. And it is also a handbook that Brunswick wrote to explain what wounds are and how to treat them. There are actually several Woundmen in this incunabulum. They all appear the same. They're copies of each other. It's just that some of them have been expanded to include a wider scene, like the second picture, where there are some medical practitioners looking at the Woundmann. It once again appears as a human figure, with this time with underwear, once again like the Welcome Apocalypse, but also this time with hair, which is a difference to the previous examples that I showed. Also very different is that even though it is being penetrated and hit by different weapons, there are less weapons used to harm this wound man, and there are also no sores or wounds, buboes, or anything. My argument for the function of this wound man is that it's once again authoritative or symbolic, but in a different way to the Wellcome MS-290, whereas that one was to show off what the owner or commissioner, what knowledge they could commission or own. I argue that the symbolic or authoritative use of the wound man in this incunabulum is more to show off what a surgeon can do and what surgery is all about. To illustrate this is like, again, the two examples that I showed. The first one being the frontispiece of the incunabulum, and it's headed by a text that states, "This is the book on surgery. It's a handbook on surgery by Hieronymus Brunswick." Apart from that, there's no other text that was originally printed on there. There is some writing, but that's by owners that doesn't relate to the contents or to the wound man at all. There is also no text found within this book that relates back to this initial wound man. It here purely serves as a frontispiece to illustrate what surgery is, what wounds are, and what surgeons can deal with. The second example, in the second example, the wound man appears at the end of the first treatise within the book and at the start of the second treatise. It states here, like the text states that after I, with the help of the Almighty God, finished this first treatise, I now call upon his firstborn son, Jesus Christ, to help me with this other treatise about wounds in general. So to talk about wounds in general. This use of general is important in the sense that it doesn't talk about specific wounds like we've seen with the fasciculus or the Wellcome Apocalypse. And if you read the text that this wound man introduces, it only talks about what wounds are and then about what surgical instruments can be used to treat them. But once again, there is no reference to the actual wound man. So here again, the wound man is used to illustrate what surgeons dealt with, what they could treat, and it, in a sense, becomes almost a calling card of the surgeon or people practicing surgery. So in conclusion, I once again show Peter Murray Jones's quote because I hope that with this talk, I've been able to show and exemplify why it is so important to look at the context in which the wound man diagrams appear for its function and also for its use. And I hope that this will also pave the way for people to realize this for other diagrams that have been around for longer. Thank you so much.
Brilliant, Quincy, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I think that the diagrams themselves, needless to say, are just fantastic. And then sort of diving into the provenance of them and kind of untangling that, I can imagine the basis for some really fascinating work. And I can imagine, I mean, needless to say, like seeing these extraordinary diagrams of these kind of individuals with all these kind of awful afflictions kind of being put upon them, I can absolutely see the appeal. But I'm interested to hear in your own words. What got you interested in kind of studying this field in the first place?
Well, particularly to the wound man, I think I first came across this diagram actually in Jack Hartnell's book that I referenced earlier called Medieval Bodies. I was already interested in medieval medicine and I saw this book and I thought, well, there's a lot of illustrations in there, and I want to know more about it, so I'm going to read this book. And I saw the wound man and I don't know why, but it was just such an interesting diagram that I thought I need to know more about this. So I started researching it more. And then actually before I started my PhD, I wanted to potentially do an article about it, but then I was luckily talked into doing a PhD so I could research this more extensively. And that is mainly how I got into it, just pure interest of seeing it in a book.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, no, that's completely fair. Like it's a fascinating. It's honestly like the first time you see it, like it's certainly my reaction was just, oh my goodness, what is this thing? Yeah, and it's brilliant as you say that you've been able to unpack some of these threads where perhaps people have initially assumed that they all serve the same purpose, but actually it's a bit more nuanced. And I guess I'm intrigued, like, why do you think it is that people have tried? It almost seems to be, I might be reading this wrong, but it seems like sort of previously scholars have tried to almost find one purpose for it, and try to kind of apply that across all different contexts. Like, do you think there's a reason that kind of that approach was initially favored?
I'm not too sure. It might be, and this is mainly me spitballing, but it might also be that when the scholarship on the wound man first started, that was the start of the 20th century. So I can assume that not that that not enough wound men had been discovered or were commonly known that people could make a more nuanced kind of view that it was different for different manuscript. Maybe there wasn't the availability of the different wound men to come to that conclusion. But that being said, I have found that it's a more common theme for other diagrams as well. It is a little bit different because, for example, with the vein man diagram, which, as the name suggests, has either like the venous system or bloodletting points on a human body, we kind of know, because there are so many examples, because they've been around for centuries already, like in the Middle Ages, we kind of know that its original function was to illustrate the bloodletting points or the venous system to then be used for bloodletting, so people knew where the veins were to then perform the phlebotomy. But and that is something that whenever historians throughout the years and decades explain this diagram, that's something they come back to. However, they also haven't really discussed that, once again, it also depends on the context. Because yes, that is their original function, but sometimes, like with the wound man, they are more symbolic of like a surgeon's craft or their knowledge and things like that. So I think it's also that it just hasn't really been considered that much in general.
Yeah, so I guess there's lots of kind of different things at play here. And it'll be interesting to kind of explore that, as you say, kind of with regards to other kind of human models that appear in lots of these different manuscripts. Yeah, and I guess I'm interested from a kind of source perspective. It seems like for some of the wound man diagrams that we've already discussed, that we can sort of reconstruct as best as we can perhaps the manuscript or the folios that they were included in. Is this always the case? As I appreciate that without the kind of full context that these diagrams are found in, it can sometimes be difficult to kind of trace back kind of their symbolism.
Yes. Yeah, it is, because it's not like with, for example, the Wellcome MS-290. It is just basically included as the last diagram in a series of diagrams that just don't seem to be related to the text at all. So initially, when I looked at it, it was a bit like, well, why is it here? We don't really know. We don't know much about the manuscript in general. So it's difficult to know. I suppose the one good thing with the wound men is that there's not a lot of examples, so so we don't have the problem of having a lot of them in very confusing contexts where we don't know. Most of them do appear in manuscripts where you can kind of guess or at least determine the context based on the manuscript itself or the incunabulum itself. But yes, it is with other diagrams, but also, once again, with the wound man in MS-290. Sometimes just not necessarily a guessing game, but there's so much uncertainty that it takes a lot of time to try and determine a function when you don't have a lot of context there, but it's something you have to deal with using the context that you have, as little as it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess so. It's almost a case of just making the best of kind of what's available. Yeah, and kind of bringing out like a good kind of nuanced response. Yeah, and it seems to me like that approach is very much is on some level a kind of paleographical one. So kind of actually looking at the manuscript, kind of looking at kind of textual clues and things like that. But I guess there's also an element of kind of looking at the visual context as well, and kind of seeing how that relates back. Yeah, I guess I'm curious, just kind of off the back of that. What kind of skills do you think people need to actually look at these kind of images and kind of get some idea, as the best kind of idea that we can about their origins?
Oh, that is an interesting one. Well, definitely, like you mentioned, paleography. Like that is quite important to understand the text that it relates to, and also the wider text of the manuscript. Not that everyone needs to read the entire manuscript. Like I am not reading the entirety of the Welcome Apocalypse, but yeah. So that is rather important to just know the text. But also some understanding of different art styles as well. Like again, with the Welcome Apocalypse, historians have argued that it is a very like German speaking area art style of like the first quarter of the 15th century. So one needs to have those skills to recognize that. But also art skills in the sense of looking at the body itself, like how it's represented, whether it was usual in that time period and in that area, and yeah, things like that. And then also, I suppose, codicological skills as well, like understanding manuscripts more broadly to know, again, using the Apocalypse as an example, understanding the context in which it was created, like with the monastic communities, like knowing that a book such as this was most likely not something that people brought on the go, because it is, I forgot to mention that, but it is a rather large manuscript as well. Like you wouldn't just carry this as a pocketbook hanging off your belt. So, and because of how richly illuminated it is, its, you know, its creation in a monastic scriptorium, and it's used there because of its contents and things like that. So there's a lot of different skills that I feel like you need to understand, like diagrams, but also illustrations and other types of illumination within manuscripts and incunabula as well. And for incunabula, it's also, I suppose, important to have the skills regarding knowing what an incunabulum is and how it relates to manuscripts, and understanding how they were created, and how they came to be, and how they were spread, and things like that. Yes, there's long answer short, there's quite a few skills that I think people need to possess, and that need to come together to have as accurate of a look at this topic and these diagrams and texts as accurately as possible.
Absolutely, I can well imagine, definitely. It sort of seems like there's lots of kind of things that one needs to factor in. And I appreciate having spoken to some other guests, like, you know, sometimes the issue is that you get sort of certain individuals who are very specialized in one area, and they can give, you know, very good ideas about one specific kind of element, as it were, but sort of all the other stuff kind of gets kind of put by the wayside. And there's not that sort of conversational, that kind of interdisciplinary work that's necessarily done. Have you found that over the course of your research, or has it been quite good for kind of communicating between different specialisms?
I think some parts have been quite well communicated. For example, looking at Peter Murray-Jones' book from 1998, the one that I mentioned, he does look a lot at like medieval illuminations, but he also does a lot with medieval medicine and medical practitioners. And in some other works, I believe he quotes like art historians and people like that. I find that generally people do quote each other from different disciplines, but it very much depends on what aspect you're looking at. Like, for example, I call these diagrams, but that is because it's also based on my own definition of a diagram, because most scholars and historians, they use different terms to mean the same thing. They will call the wound man, for example, a diagram, an illustration, an image, a picture. They will use different terms for the same, like, wound man. And they don't really, like, different disciplines don't really seem to, what I found, communicate with each other in terms of that terminology. So I, for example, had to look at art history. I looked at science, like scientific articles, I think, and philosophical articles, to basically bring that together and make a definition for that. So yeah, to answer your question, it very much depends on what aspect you're looking at. Sometimes there's very good collaboration, and other times it's very much like you have to do the work yourself.
Absolutely, I can well imagine. And dare I suggest as well that even the terminology, as you've just said, can almost color the way that you think about these particular figures. I can imagine describing it perhaps say as a scientific diagram as opposed to an illustration can have some impact on the way that people think about these figures, the way they process it. I mean, even now I'm trying to sort of rack my brains for a more sort of neutral term to kind of phrase this discussion point. But yeah, I guess that's another kind of issue as well, like which terminology you use and kind of what expectations that sets.
Yeah, I think I do have my supervisors to thank for this as well, because basically from the start they were very clear about, like, define your terminology, make sure you understand your terminology and know what you use. So again, I worked on the definition, like my definition of a diagram, and based on that, I only, for my thesis, look at diagrams and not at things that I perceive or define as illustrations. But within my work, I will have to explain what is a diagram and how is it different to an illustration, and why do I not look at illustrations. So yeah, it's been rather interesting, but also good to have that established, even though sometimes it can, sometimes it is rather difficult, even with having found a definition and using specific terms. Like, for example, my first chapter is actually on John Ardern and the diagrams of his Practica of Fistula in Anno, which has human body diagrams, but then there's also the surgical instruments that John Ardern made himself. And they are usually included in those manuscripts as well. But then recently I came kind of across, like, would I classify that as a diagram or as an illustration? So it's very interesting, even after having defined it. It's something that's rather flexible with a lot of things in history. It's not that static, but it is important to have that terminology for myself and for hopefully future readers of the thesis.
100%. Yeah, and I guess as well to be aware of, like, how terms can interchange, like the tension between them. Yeah, definitely. I think that's very important. Yeah, and I guess sort of moving on now to the actual manuscripts themselves. I wanted to start just with a bit of a contextual question, and forgive me, this might be a little bit kind of broad and brushstroke, but just for the benefit of any listeners that might be less familiar with the period, am I right in thinking that it was more than just like medical professionals that kind of collected diagrams like these, like say, for example, monks or scholars who were kind of more broadly interested. Like, what was the kind of scene of people like collecting diagrams, for lack of a better phrase, like this?
Yeah, if we're looking specifically at medical diagrams and the ones that I'm looking at, it is a wide, like very wide group of people. It wasn't just medical practitioners like your physicians, surgeons, barber surgeons, apothecaries, etc. It wasn't just them who owned these books. Like, for example, like with the Welcome Apocalypse, it was monastic communities. But then there's also the argument to be said, well, some of them might have been medical practitioners as well, because they were like the, I forgot what it's called now, the person practicing surgery and medicine within a monastery. But then there is also people who were just interested in having medical texts, sometimes just for personal interest, who didn't actually practice it, but also sometimes, as potentially with the Welcome MS-290, just to show off that someone owned this kind of text. Like, I own something by an authority, I own these authoritative diagrams, look at what I have. And it's another example is a very, very interesting manuscript roll, actually, which it could also be argued for that it was used as like a symbolic or authoritative thing. It is a copy of some of John Ardern's text, but it's a very long like roll. I forgot exactly how long it is, but it's and we don't know who it was created for or who by, but as looking at the format and how impractical it was to actually use it as a reference or learning device or anything like that, it most likely was commissioned by someone who just wanted to have this knowledge, either to show it off or just to, yeah, probably mainly to show it off that they had this. And that doesn't, like, it could have been a medical practitioner who was like, look at me, I've got this, but it could have also been a non-medical practitioner who just wanted to show off that they had a manuscript of like a text written by Ardern or other people, or Galen or other authorities. So yeah, it's a very wide group of people who would have owned manuscripts and incunabula with these diagrams.
Crikey. And I can imagine that that makes it all the more difficult to kind of I guess look at the kind of proper context of these, just given that there were so many kind of uses for them, I suppose, outside of just like strictly kind of medical reference or anatomical knowledge.
Yes.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, and I guess drilling down into some of the specific examples. I was really intrigued by how you mentioned with the Welcome Apocalypse manuscript that the diagram depicted is of no kind of particular gender. And I'd be interested to know, like, what was your kind of methodology in discerning that?
Yes. So, God, this is a large part of my thesis, but at the moment I have narrowed it down to looking at the appearance of these diagrams, and I've narrowed it down to 3 characteristics that I have found in the Middle Ages would be sometimes a definitive way, outward way, of determining someone's sex or gender. And that the first one would be hair, which also comes from both a social and cultural points of view, like related to gender, but also to more medical and biological points of view, where it had to do with the constitution of someone's body, like difference, like male-female body, etc. Where it was believed that men often had shorter hair, but they, due to their body heat, had like body hair as well. And women, on the other hand, they had longer hair on their head, but due to them being colder, like their constitution being colder, they didn't really like have much body hair, with the exception of axillary hair and pubic hair for whatever reason. So that was believed. And looking at these diagrams, the 3 out of 4 that I talked about today, they are bold, and some people would argue that this then shows that it's a male body because, well, females had long hair. But it's also not that easy because baldness was also often associated with something being wrong with the body, with the humors inside of the body, causing someone to lose hair rapidly. Or it could be related to madness as well. Like there are depictions of like some fictional stories where people would like pull out their hair or just be bald because of their madness as well, and that could sometimes have illustrations with it as well. But it could also be related to surgery because the woodman has a head wound. So for a head wound to heal, it would need air, and that was understood. So sometimes the head might be shaved. So that is why with the example of the Welcome Apocalypse, I would say that hair would doesn't necessarily determine the diagram's sex, because its baldness relates to it being more of like an ill or wounded body rather than a particular like sex body. And as for the lack of body hair in this example, it doesn't define it as a female body because body hair was not as common yet in like illumination in general around this period. That was something that became more common at the end of the 15th century towards the 16th century. And a second thing that I looked at is breasts, because it was understood in the Middle Ages that female bodies had breasts, male bodies did not have breasts. But at the same time, breasts also had a very strong link to milk production and pregnancy. So I would argue that for the Wound Man, specifically the Welcome Apocalypse one, the lack of breast doesn't necessarily mean that doesn't necessarily define it as a male body, but it more so shows that there is a lack of pregnancy and lack of milk because the Wound Man doesn't deal with milk production or pregnancy. So it would be rather unnecessary to add breasts because the diagram doesn't say anything about related to that. And then the last characteristic I look at is genitalia, because again, in the Middle Ages, male genitalia, female genitalia. There are also texts about intersex people, but that gets more complicated. But in general, generally speaking, believed there were female genitalia, male genitalia, inward versus outward. But in the Welcome Apocalypse, they're covered. So we don't actually see them. So we can't determine that. So I think for the Welcome Apocalypse, the baldness, lack of breasts, and the lack of genitalia, looking at those characteristics, there's nothing, none of them have a clear answer as to which sex it's meant to convey or meant to be. But once again, this also differs per Woodman and per diagram, but that is so far what I have found.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, as I guess sort of the assumption would be if it's say Wound Man, that it would just be like a male body. And I guess sort of, even in the Middle Ages, there was that kind of assumption that anything to do with anatomy and so the would just kind of default to that. But that's really interesting. That the actual what we actually see is a lot more nuanced and it's not sort of clear cut either way. Yeah, and I think that's really fascinating to think about. And I guess we might be treading kind of into speculative territory here. But I'm interested, do you think that there's anything interesting there about sort of what this meant for kind of anatomy or surgery or kind of understanding of medicine? Or do you think it's just perhaps just something that we don't have perhaps enough kind of information on to kind of extrapolate anything else of yet?
Well, it's very interesting because I think this is something that I'm trying to answer in my thesis, or at least look at as well. I don't have the answer yet, but I do think there is a possibility that it might mean something, because I have looked at several historians and scholars that talk about medical diagrams in the Middle Ages in general. And some of them, not all of them, but most of them classify these diagrams, like basically all medical diagrams minus the diseased woman, all of the medical diagrams, they classify them as male bodies because they argue that male bodies were seen as standard, and therefore that's where they were used within medical manuscripts. But looking at examples like the Welcome Apocalypse, it's way more nuanced than that. And I want to argue, want to look at and argue within my thesis that it doesn't necessarily looking at more nuanced bodies, but also potentially looking at bodies that might be more obviously one sex or another. It will probably have an effect, or might even not have an effect on the actual theory itself, because something that scholars also argue is that medicine was so focused on the male body, and it only discussed female medicine or the female body when it concerned something that was only applicable to the female body, like pregnancy and things like that. But looking at how the bodies are represented, and also in combination with the text and how the text talks about medicine, I think it can give some very interesting results on how the Middle Ages actually viewed bodies within medicine, and may or may not actually have seen male bodies as standard.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that'll be a really fascinating strand of your thesis to explore more. Absolutely, especially as I guess it could sort of, I guess question in some ways kind of the assumption that, kind of every kind of body and kind of as it was depicted was kind of assumed to be a man unless, kind of otherwise specified. Yeah, so I think that'll be really interesting, and hope that bears fruits.
Me too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, then I guess in terms of the actual form itself, I think one thing that no doubt kind of really stands out to me, obviously there's a real myriad of different afflictions that the wound man is suffering from. But there does seem to be a particular preponderance for weaponry and sort of violent injury. And it seems to me that perhaps even if that's not necessarily the most kind of predominant kind of injury, that seems to be the thing that kind of stands out the most, just as you kind of immediately see the diagram. And I'm interested, is there sort of any particular significance or reason for this? Or is that just like one kind of like quirk of the diagrams?
That's a good question. It's something that I have yet to look at in more detail, but it does, from a first glance, seem that the wound man very much relates to potentially like battlefield surgery and things like that, with it having like that many weapons and stuff like that. But if one looks at the text, it doesn't necessarily mention that. Like, for example, in the Welcome Apocalypse, where some wounds where it has a sword on the actual diagram, the text will mention just a general cut rather than a cut specifically by a sword. I don't know exactly why they chose to depict a sword instead of a knife, because there are sometimes also knives depicted. Perhaps it was for the visual appeal or something like that. I don't really have an answer at the moment, but I have noticed that, and it's something that I do want to look into, because if it was more related to battlefield surgery, then there's also that whole sex and gender thing coming in with men going off to fight and things like that. So yes, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that'll be interesting to kind of dive into that as well. And I guess another thing that really interested me as well is just kind of thinking about the actual physicality of the object. I understand that it's a fairly big kind of manuscript, and of course you have this very kind of prominent human diagram with some, but in not all cases, these kind of reference points or these kind of text boxes. Yeah, I'd be interested. Like, compared to say like a standard kind of reference where you have like say a table of contents and things like that. Do you think perhaps the imagery would have an impact on the way that people would interact with the text? I appreciate this is all very speculative, but just kind of for curiosity's sake.
Mm. I feel like it probably did, because it now is a visual representation that people could see the actual, well, not 100% accurate, but like see the actual wound depicted on a body, rather than it being like, written down like, wound on the arm, treat it this way. It's actually shown what such a wound might look like and where on the arm it might appear, rather than wound on the lower arm, wound on the upper arm. But it's like, where on the upper arm, where on the lower, like how big is it, stuff like that. And whilst I recognize that the diagram might not be 100% accurate in all the wounds that it's trying to depict, it is like a visual aid, I suppose, for people to either have it as a quick reference or even maybe as a learning point to know where these particular wounds would be or what they might look like.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess like having that kind of visual reference, as you say, like would be so much, I guess, more impactful than having to like kind of scan through like reams and reams of text saying, oh, it's like on this bit of the arm at this particular angle, at this kind of size and depth. And I could see that getting very clunky very fast. So yeah. Oh, that's interesting stuff. And I guess just to kind of round up the discussion, it seems like there's so much more stuff to kind of dive into this. It's sort of, my impression is that we've sort of barely scratched the surface. So I guess just in a very, I appreciate this is quite a broad question, but in a kind of a brief way, where would you like to go next with this research?
Well, I want to look at more diagrams besides the wound man, which I've kind of started doing, especially the ones that I included in the different series, like that I mentioned, like the 9 picture series and the 5 figure series, or the other way around. No, but yes, especially those, which I will be looking at, and also, like I mentioned, I'm also looking at John Ardern's diagrams, which are of the lower human body, like fully not having the upper half in the diagrams either. So also just looking at different types of diagrams, and just also the different, like what I've kind of done now, just the different contexts also with the original text, and how that influenced potentially the depiction of stuff like that, of the diagrams themselves. God, there was something else I was going to say and I completely forgot. I'm blanking. But yes, just basically looking at more diagrams, the ones that reappear throughout the centuries. But again, I do focus on the 14th and 15th. And yeah, there's just the different contexts in which they are found. And also, this was the other aspect I just remembered. I also want to look at the social and cultural influences within the societies that these works were created, to see if that had any impact on the actual representation of the body inside of the manuscript. So kind of, again, bringing together society, culture, and medicine to see if that had an effect on the representation of the body and how it was seen.
Fantastic. All sounds like really good stuff. And final question, if our listeners want to learn more about this topic in general, where are some good places for them to start learning more?
Oh God, that's a good question. I mean, if they want to know stuff about medical illumination in general, I would recommend Jack Hartnell's book, and also definitely Peter Murray Jones's work. Like, he's done a lot on that. And yes, I appreciate that might be a bit difficult with, it being resources and historical sources being rather inaccessible sometimes. But there are, I know there's like blogs out there as well. Like, I know that the University of Glasgow, I think their special collections do some write articles that are freely accessible that I have looked at before, where they look at particular manuscripts. For me, it's been very helpful to look at the John Ardern manuscripts that they've got. And just in general, like sometimes archives have blogs where they will focus on particular manuscripts or diagrams and things like that, or authors. And I would also say probably podcasts like this one today, where there's all sorts of very interesting topics that, again, freely available for anyone to listen to and watch.
Brilliant. Fantastic stuff. Quinty, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. It seems like there's going to be lots of brilliant work for this, hopefully, in the future. Yeah, and I hope that lots of the research that will be done on this will continue to bear fruit and continue to dive into this. It seems like there's just so many more areas that we can explore.
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much as well for inviting me for this talk today.
Not at all. It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks very much to all of our listeners for watching. We hope you enjoyed our discussion today. And we hope that you'll join us for the next one. Until then, take care.